Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Insights from Women Leaders series. My name is Rola Kaakeh. I am the host of the series and will be having the conversation with the guest leader today. Now, a little bit about the series. We launched the Insights from Women Leaders series back in October of 2020 to highlight the journeys and contributions of various women leaders who share their insights on a range of topics impacting their industries, our communities, and their role in shaping the future. Our guests have included leaders from various prestigious and reputable institutions from across the globe. Their backgrounds are diverse, their accomplishments many, and the insights and perspectives they provided are extremely valuable. Now, the goal of this series is to learn from women thought leaders and decision makers to empower both current and future leaders, both men and women, to positively impact organizations and communities. Diversity of thought, experiences, industries, education, and training is important to us as it highlights the mosaic of perspectives represented in different settings that help drive decision-making and positive change. Now, I'll have about a 40-minute conversation with the leader, structured using questions we've traditionally asked our guest leaders. We do this intentionally to allow you to see the differences in responses and lived experiences of these different leaders. After that, I ask questions that were sent to us from the public prior to the session. And if this is of interest to you for future leaders as well, you can submit your questions ahead of time. Now it's time to welcome our guest leader today, Madhuri Sebastian. She is a digital health leader on a mission to connect and unlock data to enable insights for better care, quality, and access. She is currently the VP of Data Management and Interoperability at Philips. She believes that the key to transformation is to bring innovation and execution together swiftly and embracing a fail fast and pivot to succeed mindset. She has successive leadership roles followed on solutions development, deployment, customer adoption, and operational excellence for major health systems as customers globally. Currently, she leads a category of interoperability and analytics solutions at Philips. Prior expertise includes leading artificial intelligence incubation and driving cloud SaaS business lines in revenue cycle, EMR and Imaging IT at GE Healthcare. She holds an MBA from Kellogg School of Management and a BS from the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater. So welcome and thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me, Rola. Very, very happy to be here.
Well, I've been excited about this conversation, so let's just go in right away. The first question we ask everybody, especially after we give a very brief highlight, I think, of your background, but when you even listen to that or when you think about your own experiences, did you expect to be where you are today?
18 years ago, I started at my professional career. 4 years before that, I moved, from India to the United States, Wisconsin-Whitewater of all the places for my college. And did I expect where I would be? No. I think, but I've been very lucky that I had a passion in technology growing up, and it kind of married my passion with healthcare, and I've really found my path, and I'm very happy to be where I'm at and doing what I do.
So we're going to spend a little bit of time in the future, and then we'll come back and talk about the current things that you're working on and what you're doing. So when we think about the future, what do you want in your future? What do you want your legacy to be?
So I think three things. That was a good question, by the way. I was like, wow, okay, I haven't thought of it that way. One is, I have 2 kids, so definitely want to be a providing, nurturing mother, and from a personal family context, be there for those that are part of that. The second, I think it's making a difference, which is why we're speaking, and I was so excited, is making a difference in women's lives and helping them reach their fullest potential in the choices that they make. And then if I kind of take that to more of a broader picture, how do I use my skill sets and my experience around technology, around business leadership to help people lead happier, healthier lives? And, that's why I'm so passionate and dedicated to the mission of healthcare transformation.
I like it. When you heard the word legacy, did you find that it's like a very big word? Do you simplify it? Like, what's your approach to that word? Because for a lot of people, it intimidates them and they kind of associate it with such a big calling. But when you read that, kind of, what was your initial reaction?
I was like, I have to say that as the first question, I looked at it, I'm like, that's a big word. That feels like a big step up to shoes to step up to. But then I said, well, what is it? It's a good question, right? Like if you think about being mindful and owning the time that you have on this earth, like what do you want it to end towards? So it was a nice, challenging start. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. No, I love that about how owning your time here and kind of figuring out what is it that you want to leave behind in a way. Now, when you look at your own past, maybe present experiences, are there certain things that kind of shaped your outlook of like what you want your future to entail, all of these different elements and how you want to make an impact?
So a few things, so I grew up in India, like I said, I moved to the US when I was, starting my undergraduate. I grew up in Calcutta, India, to be specific. And I was very lucky to be part of a family where it was, there was a lot of focus on education, where it was about, what are you doing for yourself and how are you growing yourself? I had, my aunts were all educated and with master's degrees. My grandmother, way back in the day, was in the 1920s, was one of the more educated women in India. So that was always a big focus. And I had the opportunity really to imbibe from a lot of strong women, my mother, and always had that focus around, what are you doing for yourself? And in fact, I had some early adversity in my life. My father passed away when I was 13, and I would say in spite of that, sort of continued to have, and it just made me even more stronger towards, hey, I want to make a difference. So what am I going to do with myself? So I think that's always been a theme, and that, that I even carry till today. And like, what am I going to do in the next 20 years with myself?
Yeah. That's really great. And I think the like you mentioned, in terms of having strong women around you is such a core, like fundamental. And you think about it when you think towards the past, like, okay, what shaped me in terms of my own thought process. And I think having those types of role models builds such a strong base for sure, in terms of being intentional with what you do in your life. Now, of course, it seems like you've had many successes, but with a lot of successes, there also comes different challenges people face, some failures. Can you share some failures or maybe challenges that you experienced that also kind of shaped your outlook, maybe made you do things a little differently? Is there, as you think back on those, is there anything you wished you would have done differently or maybe made a conscious effort about doing in the future? So like, what is your lessons learned from those types of failures and challenges?
I'll give you an example. So here I am, like we were saying, right? New to this country, Calcutta to Wisconsin-Whitewater, crazy journey, right? Doing school, and very excited to get my first job. And I interviewed for what I thought was the perfect job for me. It was a consulting company in Madison, Wisconsin, and it was like my dream job. I interviewed along with a dear friend of mine, and there were two. They picked the other friend, other candidate. And I was devastated. This was very early on. And I was like, oh my God, what is going to happen? And, I remember applying for another internship, and that company description was something about like X-ray medical equipment. And, I was like, what am I going to do there? But you know what, like I didn't get this opportunity you wanted. I wanted an internship, so I'm going to go ahead with it anyway. Well, guess what? That company turned out to be General Electric Healthcare. And
that sounds familiar from your background. That sounds familiar.
I got recruited into a leadership technology program, and and kind of never looked back since then, right? Yeah. So when I reflect on that story, and I have to keep periodically reminding myself is that we have to be open. And when something doesn't happen the way we want it to be, it's sort of looking around, and there's another door that leads you somewhere that you hadn't anticipated, but that journey maybe way more interesting than the path you wanted to be on in the first place. So that's I guess a lesson, if you will, that I try to carry on, even today and going forward. I tell my kids that.
Yeah. And that's powerful because it focuses your intention. It like removes the focus on you just focusing on that one failure or that challenge in a way, and then just allows you to just look around. Right. And like you said, there could be other things. It's like, well, if this is kind of closed off, that means there has to be something else around, which I think is really, really solid advice. Now, when you think about the future in general, what excites you about the future?
So what excites me about the future is just technology, right? Like if you take a step back and if you looked at even just where we are today with the pandemic and, well, maybe soon to be endemic, but the fact that with mRNA, we could have a vaccine in 18, 24 months, right? And we're not in 100 years ago where it would take a much, much longer cycle. I think the power of technology, like every time I get into the Tesla and it does something and I'm like, oh my God, how did it do that, right? The power of technology, if you even just reflect even in my lifetime, the BlackBerry time versus, when you thought that was it and now there's an iPhone, like my children will never know what a BlackBerry is, what a landline is, right?
Dial up.
But if you think about the span of innovation in such a short time,
it's incredible.
The internet didn't exist when I was in high school, right? And it was like, and you're like, wow. Yeah. That's what excites me the more. It's how we can really use technology and apply it to some of the deepest problems that we still have, which, for example, healthcare, which is what I do, and how can we go faster and deeper to solve some really interesting outcomes?
Yeah, no, it's incredible. I feel like technology is every time I think about the future, right? We can help design it in a way, but there's also things that we would have never imagined, which I think is also wonderful about, thinking about technology. Because I was there in the dial-up days. I remember you could either use the phone or the internet, not both at the same time. Landlines are definitely a thing. For sure. So it's very different. So as you think about the future and kind of all the different elements in terms of the challenges that we're currently experiencing or what we will experience in the future, we talk a lot about, what can we do as like building our skills or what tools we need to kind of move us forward and address some of these challenges. So what are some tools you think we need or maybe skills that we need to build moving forward?
So I think there's sort of two skill sets that are really critical. One is being comfortable with technology. Is whether you take a coding class yourself, whether you do learn about how to code. It is such a fundamental way to understand automation, to understand things like artificial intelligence. Having that domain, and everybody can do it, right? If the kids can do it, it's probably more harder for us to do it than for the kids to adopt it. But how are you kind of going out there and embracing your technology skill sets, right? If you're in legal or if you're in communications, take the time to get more deeper in technology. And then I think the second part is around empathetic leadership, is really understanding the human element. So while advancing yourself technologically, also understanding the human element and bringing people together to solve some of because the problems that are there to solve are more harder and more complex and more macro, right? So how do you kind of connect the what to the why and bring people together? And that starts with empathetic leadership.
Yeah, I love that. I think that combination too, which I think is kind of that human side to even integrating technology, right? To constantly think it's not just about creating the technology, it's where is that human element to it, which is kind of the empathetic side. Let's talk a little bit now about current things that you're working on. So what current initiatives that you are working on, what current initiatives are you working on that you're really most excited about?
It's about connecting data. If you think about the amount of data that's generated, like how much data, if you have an Apple Watch, how much data is it generating about your sleep, your movement, your patterns? If you connect that with, the data that your doctor has about you when you go for your annual checkups, right? Your blood markers, your blood sugar, etc. And then, if you have some predisposition based on family history, etc., and if you've been in an urgent care setting, or if you've been admitted, for some other sort of acute issue, or if you have a chronic condition, right? if you start thinking about, all of this data exists and we're constantly generating more data, but it's not all connected. So we don't have a picture of what Rola should do. Should she, take a certain lifestyle modification at this stage to improve her health based on her predispositions and based on how she is performing? I think if we start connecting the data and we enable, at the macro population level, we'll become so much more smarter in how we move from sort of the reactive care that exists today to the proactive care. And that's what I get to work on, is connecting these data silos through interoperability, bringing the right analytics on to give that sort of single view to, even if you take a very specific domain like radiology or cardiology, and you use a patient's going in for a continuous oncology follow-up, and you apply artificial intelligence to see what their prognosis could be based on patients like me, or the radiologist kind of automatically has the lesion progression, digression statistics, and it's not having to manually do it. And you start impacting, radiologist burnout, you start impacting a better outcome, then you start impacting, information for that patient's family, that's care team. So there's so much we can do if we connected the data and brought the right insights. And that's why I love what I do, is, I get to be part of solving that problem.
Yeah, I always think about this because the amount of data that we've never had in human history, right? Just the amount, but it's no longer just about the amount. It's just that even when we have that data, it's only giving us a snapshot. Like you had mentioned, it's only given us a snapshot from that particular data source at that particular time, and being able to integrate all of them to give you the full picture of someone's life. The same thing applies with healthcare in general. Is like when you're seeing a patient, you're seeing them for that 1 hour, but in reality, they have a whole world outside that they haven't brought in that type of data to you for that. So I think, yeah, definitely the power of data is very significant. Now, are there any obstacles or challenges that you constantly think about, things that keep you up at night? Although we love sleep, but in terms of things that you worry about?
I think not going fast enough, right? I think you can, it's how to not be the hamster on a wheel, right? So you're very busy and you're doing a ton, right? You're especially in the space of digitization, healthcare data, you could put a ton of effort, but did you actually move the needle for the patient, for a physician, for the healthcare system? And, every day I wake up and I'm like, what am I going to do? The top 3 things that is going to move the needle, because otherwise you can get so caught up in this continuous loop of actions, but are you actually making progress? And it's kind of keeping conscious of that, and how, it's as simple as don't be a hamster in the wheel. Like, how do I not be a hamster on a wheel is probably what keeps me up at night.
Yeah, that's fair. Being very intentional with the actions that you do take. Because when you said not be fast enough at first, I thought, it's incredible because we started this conversation that technology is going so fast in a way for some people. But at the same time, like you said, is that if it's not intentional for what it is that we're, if we're collecting all this data, but we're not using it, if we're, doing all of these actions, but it's not moving the needle forward, I think is a good way to think about it, because you're trying to assess whether your actions do lead to the outcomes that you want. Now, have there been any new initiatives that have emerged as a result of the pandemic?
Telehealth. Like, if you think about, it was always sort of at the cusp, but the pandemic really forced healthcare institutions and patients and physicians to embrace telehealth. I think it is here to stay. I have to tell you, I have not had a single in-person pediatrician appointment for my children in the last 2 years, even after things started going normal. Which, oftentimes, luckily, if it's a well checkup, is fine to do virtually. But just having that access, that flexibility, not, doing imaging. So if you need a CAT scan or an MR scan, being able to do it closer to your home. So we're seeing a ton of sort of out of hospital rather than inside the hospital imaging that traditionally used to be, again, kind of narrowing down on kind of radiology or cardiology or oncology. So I think this whole sort of telehealth, I just read recently one of the malls in Rochester is being turned to a healthcare facility for people to receive outpatient care. So I think we're going to see more and more care at home, care for people closer to their homes. And, I think that changes how you're able to, again, bring data back together to give the right diagnosis at the right time, now in a much more distributed fashion, because your patients and your care providers and your caregivers and your physicians are all, a virtual network.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Now they're more easily accessible amongst each other. So the ability to connect to them works. And I often think though, because telehealth as a concept existed before the pandemic, but the ability, like you had mentioned too, that we need to be able to adopt things and like take it on and just, I think the pandemic pushed everyone to, whether those resistors of telehealth before, basically became their reality. So I think we saw the power of technology to propel ideas that existed before in a way that it could benefit everybody for sure. So I think before it was so hard to get healthcare providers to talk about telehealth because there was that big resistance. And then I think the pandemic came and just like everyone kind of had to accept it, but now people have leveraged it in new ways that I think will continue to grow, like you mentioned, for sure. Now, we are going to transition to talking about success. You can talk about success in terms of your own professional success, how you see success in the work that you do. But to start off this conversation, we like to first define success. So how do you define success?
Success, this is, by the way, another of those like, wow, I need to take a moment questions. It's just, for me, the success is how do you impact somebody else's outcome?
Okay.
And that could be, your team that you're inspiring, that you're growing. How do you let people reach their fullest potential? How do you bring up the level of what I call the level of the game around you, around your peers, around your broader teams? How, as a leader, you have a tremendous amount of influence in what people do with their time and how motivated they are, how you're connecting the what to the why. So success for me at the end of it all is, did I make a positive outcome in somebody's sort of mission and purpose and time?
So do you use that? So that's your own, I think, your own personal and professional definition as well. Nice. So when we talk about, so we see success as our own individual or with our teams, like you mentioned, in terms of the influence that the leader has. And so we often know that, success doesn't just happen at an individual standpoint, even among a team. It's creating those environments for success that really allows you to have sustainable success or, multiple wins in a way. But how do you create in your own environment for success?
So I'm very intentional about my time, because again, that's sort of something I believe in. And for me, that create that environment for success it's actually nothing glamorous. It's sleeping the amount that's required. It's exercising. It is, taking the time to disconnect from work and engage with the family and being present. It's taking the time for things outside the work, like, a random museum day, to keep yourself creative. It's creating that network of help. I don't have to do it all. And it's really owning and leaning into that. That for me, that helps me kind of show up and bring the best self to whatever I'm doing, whether it's at work or outside work, or and it's sort of creating that care routine, I guess, if you would say. So you have to realize, again, you own your time, and how do you want to spend your time, and where are you fitting in your self-care and your nurturing, whatever that may be, reading a book or or doing nothing.
Mm-hmm. Nothing time. Yeah. It's amazing that even the nothing time, because we've been so distracted by like technology and the use of everything, and like that time, I think I read an article about how like people's nothing time has really reduced, because we think we always need to be doing something, looking at something, but the power of that to like rejuvenate your brain in general, I think is really powerful. Now, you did mention a little bit, because that goes into our next question about support, about that you can't really do everything all the time. I think as many leaders, for some of us, it's very hard to ask for help, even though, we do recognize that it's difficult to be able to do everything. But I think everyone's needs differ, and like how they seek support is very different. So how do you seek support, or how have you prioritized these types of like support conversations throughout your career? And any advice that you can give to our audience about that?
Having the right framework of mentors and coaches, I cannot underscore that. I have been so blessed to have amazing leaders that I've worked for, both men and women, throughout my career, that I have learned from, that have leaned on, that have, kind of guided me in different stages, and making that conscious time and effort to build those sort of like-minded connections, so that you build those sort of relationships where you can teach them something, you learn something from them. I think it's super critical. So, just like, we spend our time, sort of at the task at hand, we have to realize our own self-development is also a task at hand. And then how are we contributing to that? And how do you get that, your sort of inspiration and energy? And how do you build that support structure and your personal board of directors, if you will, that you can kind of lean on? And it can be fluid and it can change from time to time based on the context. But, how do you kind of create that support structure for yourself, that you can pick the phone and call someone and get a perspective on X, Y, or Z? I think it's super important. And, part of it, I've been lucky because I, have gotten that. But as I've progressed through my career, I've also realized that I've been lucky. So now I make a conscious effort to kind of continue that and enrich the relationships where I get that kind of insight and energy from.
And have you found it easier over time to kind of ask for help or ask for advice, or is it still hard?
I think it's easier because I'm more used to it now.
Okay.
And, I just recently changed companies, and, it's been a kind of learning a new network, learning a new culture, learning a new organization. And of course, there's a little bit of like, okay, I'm shy, right? And it's been an incredibly supportive environment for me. So it's been easy also, but also, I'm, if I compare myself 10 years ago, like, because I know it's something that I need to consciously do, in that way, it's easier, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And you didn't note right now about the whole supportive environment. And that's so important, because if there's a supportive environment, it's much easier to ask for help, right? Because you feel like you're not going to be judged, or, there isn't elements of just kind of that sensitivity around it, because the other person is really there, like, to support you in what you need. And I think that allows for people to be more open. I think in environments where people are not supportive, right, people are afraid because they kind of feel like they're kind of need to watch their back in a way. And so I think that is such a critical point for a lot of people, because if you create environments that are supportive, people are more likely to ask for help and feel like they can trust you to ask for help. So both as leaders and as individuals ourselves. So that's great. Now let's talk a little bit about leadership in general. We ask all of our guest leaders a question on leadership, and that is, how do you describe a leader? You said, the business of business is not business. The business of business is to improve the state of the world. And this is a quote by Mark Benoff. So you said, find the mega trends, connect the strategy, but it has to link to the improvement of something fundamental. As a leader, help connect the what to the why for your team to enable and power them. Can you elaborate a little bit on this and what's really shaped your outlook for this?
Yeah, I've had the chance to study different leaders, right, through conferences or, web talks, etc. Mark Benioff always stood out to me, and what he's done with Salesforce, I think, is amazing. It didn't exist, and then look at where it's now. And this whole sort of customer success, customer-focused mindset, right? And being able to kind of connect it to, it's not about the business. If you solve for a customer's outcome, business growth will follow. I think really resonated with me, and I bring that to what I do. And I've always done it. Are you solving the outcome for the customer, right? And and in the context of healthcare, it's always easy to kind of have an aspirational and inspirational goal, but it's super important then to connect what people are doing. If you're an engineer that are coding, or if you are, a program manager managing a project, or if you're a product leader getting something out the door, or if you're a salesperson that's sort of in the cycle, it's sort of how do you stitch it together so you can connect the what people are doing to the why, because that's when you get the magic. That's when, we talked about that in the beginning, how do you get everybody to bring sort of their A game in the context of, something more than something more towards the higher purpose. And it's finding that higher purpose. And I think that higher purpose comes from actually solving something meaningful.
Yeah, definitely. Now, when we think about leadership in general, and you've worked with, I think, very diverse stakeholders and individuals kind of across in terms of background, do you find that leadership in general, or do you think that leadership varies across different sectors or across different backgrounds, or is there something kind of consistent you've seen across the board?
So I think in healthcare, leadership looks different. I think the context has to be much more human and empathy driven, because at the end of it all, there's a patient, which could be you, which could be somebody that is your loved one. And I think that in healthcare especially, that keeping that front and center, and kind of going back to what I said is like, are you moving the needle as a leader, right? Are you actually changing an outcome, and is it fast enough? Because I don't think we can afford to wait to continue to have these silos of data and inefficient healthcare with all of the burnout. And, if anything has extrapolated all of the challenges, it's COVID, and look at everything that happened. So I think there's a sense of urgency that's required in healthcare, and sort of that extra tenacity, but it's grounded on empathy at the end.
Definitely. You have to keep the human centered and focused within that. Leadership in general is very much a hot topic in many ways. Like there's so many articles, so many books, so many conversations around leadership. But what do you think we're getting wrong about leadership?
I think we don't listen to dissenting voices enough. And it is part of that comes from having people around you that have different backgrounds, different opinions, different thought processes. But are we consciously, again, part of the process of decision making, hypothesis forming, are we seeking out dissenting voices? And I always like to think that if it was easy, it would have been solved by now, right? So problems are complex. They're not black and white. There's gray. And are you seeking the dissenting voices so that you can have a holistic picture? So, if I take that at the macro level and I look at sort of what's happening with the world, and it's how do we come together with different opinions to kind of go towards an outcome? So to me, that's kind of missing. And, how do we do more of that is sort of my wish, ask, something I definitely try to be conscious about.
Yeah, I like that. Sure. Now, when we noticed kind of a trend within the series, we very much focus a lot about, different advice or skills or thought process and kind of lessons learned within different areas. So with it pertains to leadership, what leadership lessons, maybe advice, can you provide to current or future leaders at different stages of their career?
And don't be afraid to take a risk. You never know, right? If you don't try, you never know. And how do you, how it's okay to get out of your comfort zone and, take a path that you didn't think you would take.
Yeah, that's a great one. Simple, but actually very powerful in terms of thinking through how it can steer you in different ways for your career. Now, when you describe a leader, or kind of you talked a little bit about this already, but when you think about all the challenges that we have to overcome and are working towards overcoming, regardless of whether you're in healthcare or other sectors, there takes certain types of leaders. You mentioned a little bit about empathetic leadership, but are there any other qualities or things that you think, the kinds of leaders we really need to address all of these big challenges?
It's it's that dissenting voice, and how do you bring towards create shared alignment and the connect the what to the why. And I think we need more of that, of kind of creating shared purpose, shared alignment across different groups, that is, you know, whether it's healthcare, whether it's other sectors, and questioning, are you going fast enough for the actual outcome, right? And, you know, and making sure that the efforts you're making result in sort of significant changes sooner rather than later.
Very nice. Now for the last question, we like to take an opportunity to support one another and recognize the positive influence we have on one another. Can you name a woman who's inspired you, and why did you choose this person?
So I will pick Indra Nooyi. I had a chance recently to listen to her on a virtual talk through Chief. And you know, what really, and I've read her book, and what really stood out to me is a few things around, you know, how sort of that bigger purpose in being able to, you know, drive towards the mega trends, and how she kind of overcame multiple points of in her career to get to where she's going. And then, you know, the work she's doing now to really kind of bring equitable care and talking about women in the workplace and giving back. I find that very inspiring, not only what she did and how she had her own leadership journey, but also how she's kind of bringing it back.
Yeah. I think that's also powerful in terms of thinking how people have not only an influence on their own career in terms of building it, kind of how they've navigated everything, but the influence they have, you know, beyond their walls. So I'm going to go in now to some of the audience questions. We received so many questions, so it's going to be hard to kind of dig through, but let's start with this one. What would you say is the biggest factor in creating your success over the years?
I think it's the sort of the focus, you know, kind of what we talked about earlier, like what are you going to do with your time, is being mindful about that, and then having the right support structure. Definitely, you know, I have an amazing spouse who's a great partner and supporter, and you know, I think that is probably, you know, the biggest one of the biggest factors around, in addition to sort of my focus with what I want to do. It's that support structure, and you know, my husband's the CEO of that support structure.
Very nice. So there's one question about how significant and fatal consequences are acceptable in a fail fast approach. So can you just elaborate a little bit more about what you mean by fail fast and how fast we have to go? And obviously you also mentioned within healthcare, it's high risk and high urgency. So how do you kind of think about that? Or, you know, how is it that you kind of design these systems in order to make sure all with that, like that the outcomes are great, but in order to do it fast enough?
It's creating those minimal viable mini experiments when you're trying to get a new product out the door. And it comes from this, you know, the book Lean Startup by Eric Ries, right? How do you create the mini experiments and say, I'm going to try this out, and it's going to either tell me A or B or C, and I'm going to get there. So then I know based on that what my next step is. So not waiting kind of for a monolithic, you know, 18-month outcome, but what am I going to do in the next 3 months, in the 6 months that'll get me towards where I want to go? And it's having kind of that courage to really question yourself, what's the right next mini experiment or series of experiments that I want to drive?
Yeah. And then if it's working, to continue to find better ways. If it's not working, to pivot and to move on to something that, or find something that works better. Yeah, I think that I think it ties a lot to with regards to your thoughts about, you know, doing things fast enough and understanding that there's still the human element to it, right? Like the patient or the individual, and that there's a lot of value in making sure that they're at their core, so that it is whatever interventions that you do are safe and, you know, have that positive outcomes for sure. Now, you did mention this a little bit in terms of the qualities of a leader. We talk a lot on the series about, you know, the need to engage with diverse stakeholders, and you mentioned this as well, in order to get different perspectives. But, you know, a lot of people talk about that, and everyone knows you kind of need to do it, but it's very difficult. So any advice that you would have to our audience for those that you really do want, you know, to have meaningful, productive conversations, and with people maybe that might not think the same way that they do about a topic or an issue or that whatnot, but it's needed in order to get all the points of view. So what advice would you provide for those individuals as they engage with diverse stakeholders? It's
not about you. And what I mean by that is don't take the response personally, like really try to remove yourself about it. And, I've had to coach myself over the years. If you're in a tough situation with a bunch of dissenting voices and you're trying to influence, but you're not getting what you want, you really have to take a step back and say, it's not about you, right? They're coming at it from their point of view. And, they're probably telling you something that you're not seeing. So how do you kind of seek that out and kind of take your opinion and your biases out of that picture is my best advice on how I cope through these sort of, getting different voices and like I said, dissenting voices. So you get a different point of view.
Yeah, I like that because it allows you to focus solely on that person and understanding where they're coming from and kind of digging more deeper. But if we attach ourselves so much with it and make it personal, right, you're not thinking as you're not listening as much, right? You're thinking so much more about like reactive versus kind of that understanding element of it. Now, there is many questions actually about how you prioritize what you work on, all the different challenges that you're doing, whether, it be in your current position or just in general. Like a lot of our audience members have different interests and different things, but there's only so many hours in a day. So is there any advice or tips that you give on prioritizing what you work on?
I think you have to decide what you want to do with your time. I think that intentionality and deciding, if there's 10 things and you only have time for 5 things, then you've got to kind of pick the 5 that drive the biggest outcome for you or for whatever context you're trying to drive. So I think definitely looking for impact versus effort is one thing, I pick, right? Let the small things go and pick the big bets. And then it's sort of continuously revisiting that and kind of removing that victim mindset, may be a strong word, but removing any traces of that and deciding like you get to own your time.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of thinking about, shifting the mindset to something that since you have the power to do it, you're able to kind of write your story in a way, I think is powerful towards people wanting to intentionally allocate their time towards something. There's one question about, we talk a lot about very good advice, that you give or other people give you or whatnot, but what is the worst advice you've been given?
I wouldn't say worst advice. I've had a few moments, but this is also something I learned. I've had a few, times, or one time I remember particularly where I was going to take a certain role, which was, a little bit of a sideways into a new initiative and a new organization that was coming up with some leaders that were not necessarily well recognized. And my other choice was to stay my current track, get promoted into a bigger role with a bigger team, a bigger responsibility. And somebody gave me the advice, like, why would you, take a sidestep, because that's completely unknown and you don't know how that's going to turn up. And these, the people you're going to work for, they're not well known or, at that time, like, why are you kind of giving up your, you're going to step back in your career. And it came from a pretty powerful figure. So I was kind of like, oh my God, I'm going to make a mistake. But I still did it. And I'm so glad I did it because, I learned so much driving transformation and transformation initiatives. It was the first time I did something on, this was back in the day when cloud was truly coming up. So my cloud skill sets improved a lot. I, really kind of became the digital leader that I wanted to be, and in a much more contemporary way versus, continuing to grow and running the next. So I think it's really important to seek out those dissenting voices, like I said, but also then staying true to yourself and getting that perspective. So if that's worth, it's not honestly the worst advice, but it was one moment where I definitely questioned myself and what I wanted to do next.
Yeah. And it's not even, like you said, it's not just about being the worst, but it might have not just fit your needs at that moment. And I think we often forget that, like, not all advice is created equal and not all advice is meant to be taken, right? And so I think what's been so great about having these types of conversations is that you're able to get insights and perspectives of different individuals, but often the times, for people's advice, it's just like, this is what happened for me, but it changed my outlook in a certain way. And I think I'm more focused on when the advice, like, how does that change your outlook or your life or your perception of it? Some advice is very narrow focused. So it's very much, well, if I take this advice, I'll become more narrow focused first. If I take some advice, it allows me to broaden my opportunities. It's a little bit different. And like you said, if it works for you, take it. If it doesn't, you can still learn from it as a different perspective, but not necessarily one that might work for you. I think this is really great. Let me see there's so many. Let me just dig through a few. What's the best way to determine if someone is a good team player?
I think it's very, are they putting the broader mission more than their individual mission? I mean, I know it sounds so simple, but it's very, at the end, people can they align behind a broader mission, right? And are they kind of bringing that extra into the broader team picture?
Yeah, like it. So think out, not just, about their own benefits, but kind of beyond that as well. We'll do one more question. This one's an interesting one, and you can obviously share, however, to the extent that you want in terms of this, but this one is, what's the best conversation you had and why?
The best conversation I had and why.
And you don't have to share like names or anything. I just thought that was a very interesting one, because sometimes we step away from conversations thinking, wow, like that was really great. But has there been a conversation where you're just like, this is a really great conversation, but really assessed what made it a really good conversation?
I've had many opportunities to have very interesting customer conversations, and some of my best conversations have been actually with upset customers, believe it or not. Because there's something's not working for them, they are expecting something else, you're not kind of giving the end outcome, but every time you go into one of those, you learn so much about sort of what's happening in their shoes. So, I can't point to sort of one specific example, but I think some of the best conversations are the toughest conversations when somebody's not pleased with your product or your service or your team. And then the question is, how do you bring it back and what do you do about it? And it can actually be a great way to build relationships in an adversarial situation. And beginning in my career, I got thrown into quite a few of those. And then over time, I learned that it's not necessarily the end of the world. If I lean into it and use this as an opportunity to actually solve the problem, I come out of it, and some of the best relationships I have professionally and then, continued on have been with these sort of tough customers way after the issues have been resolved.
Yeah, because I feel like and from what I'm hearing too from you is that because you're learning and you're kind of stepping into their shoes, which is, I think, a theme that you keep talking about, right? Like, so the ability to really understand the person in front of you. And sometimes when the person is like saying exactly what you're saying, you're not really learning that, like, right? You're not really having to step into their shoes to see what their obstacles are or what they are facing. So I think that ties in really nicely, actually, to a lot of the things that you said, because I mean, in a lot of the conversations, even as I think about it, is like the ones I really like and that are memorable is one that, you feel like you've seen the person in a different way, right? You might have understood the person. Maybe also you might have felt seen in a different way, but then you're also learning something, right? Often many of us kind of step away. You're like, wow, I just learned something either about myself or the products that I'm working on or the services that we're providing. So yeah, that is really great. Okay, so just in order to make sure that we stay on time, because there's just so many different questions, I do want to give you just now an opportunity if there's anything additional you want to add to what we've already talked about, as we start to close off here.
Well, first, thank you. This has been an amazing chat. I feel, that very energized by it and humbled, really, to be able to, kind of get and share my thoughts and opinions along the way. And continue doing what you're doing. I think it's great that you're driving conversations like this at this kind of a forum. I've had the chance to listen to Claire, as you know, and some of the other speakers, and I think it's fascinating. And I think it's only by having these conversations, we can kind of step up the broader game. So really happy to be here.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much for saying that. And obviously, I truly appreciate you taking the time. I know when we initially talked about it, you're like, this is something I'm very passionate about, which I think is just very exciting to me personally, but for a lot of other people, as they kind of see that, like, you are able to find people that are more than happy and willing to support other women, other leaders, because the ability to drive change kind of beyond ourselves, right, is to make sure that people feel empowered and, feel like they can hear different stories of the ways that people are still being able to be successful and make an impact. So I think that's been a big driver of what we do. So I greatly appreciate, I know all the audience greatly appreciates you guys taking the time, and they've been absolutely wonderful. So thank you so much again. And for everybody, we do have many other women leaders joining us for these series. So make sure that if you want to submit your questions, you can do so on our website. And of course, you can hear other guest leaders like Claire and all these others on our website at salusvitaegroup.com. So thank you all so much, and thank you again.